Chapter 36-33. Actually, he did not approve of children eating these things, but he felt that there was no need to be too harsh on his youngest daughter. It was fine as long as she was happy. Upstairs, Shiwali started to pack her luggage. Lin Cece held her hand and asked softly, "Are you really going to be with him?" Shiwali shook her head. "No, I'll find a way to leave and go abroad." Lin Cece frowned. "Aren't you afraid that he'll do something to your parents?" "He won't. Actually, Mulin isn't that bad of a man." Shiwali smiled lightly and continued packing. "Let's put it another way. He's been sacrificing for me for the past few years. If it wasn't for me, he wouldn't have entered this circle. I know he likes being a lawyer." She smiled helplessly. After packing, she looked at Lin Cece. "Cece, I know you care about me, but it's really not that bad. If Anan likes him, maybe they could be together in the future. Anan has to have a father. You want to give it in to him?" Lin Cece asked incredulously. Shiwali shook her head. "I want to communicate with him. He has a family, and he won't want to lose everything. Smart men know how to choose, especially when he's Mulin." Lin Cece sat on the sofa, deep in thought. "You said that Lao Bai is still alive. Do you think he's pranking you?" "He's doing it on purpose. I've seen normal men cheat on their wives, and I've never seen anyone as righteous as Mulin." Shiwali glared at Lin Cece. Lin Cece raised her hand. "All right, I won't call you Bai Shaosan." Bai Shaosan was angry. She pulled her luggage and walked out. Lin Cece stood at the door. "Shiwali." Shiwali turned around. Lin Cece smiled faintly. "If you have an argument, come and stay for a few days. If you don't like him, find a man to piss him off." "I know." Shiwali's eyes were a little hot. "Cece, I'm leaving first. We'll meet again later. I'll probably stay in City B for now." Everything depended on the outcome of her negotiation with Mulin. Actually, from Lin Cece's point of view, there was no need to negotiate. They would eventually go to bed. In her heart, Shiwali and Mulin were not on the same level. Mulin could eat Shiwali up without leaving a single bone. Shiwali pulled her suitcase downstairs. When Mulin saw her, he got out of the car and helped her put her in the trunk. Then, he opened the door for her and got into the car. He drove himself. The car drove straight back to the condominium. As it was a big condominium of 500 square meters, Anan was quite happy. She ran back and forth a few times. Mulin even let her sit on his stomach to play games. She giggled happily. Shiwali was packing her luggage in the bedroom. From time to time, she would listen to Anan's voice outside. Anan rarely laughed like this. She was as restrained as a little boy. Now that she heard it, she felt a little bitter. She had been taking care of Anan alone for the past few years. Although Gu Changfeng had taken care of her, she did not want to trouble others all the time. Sometimes, she had to work, and Anan could only play by himself. She did not know when Anan had become like a boy. Shiwali bit her lips, a little stunned. At this moment, Mulin leaned against the door and looked at her quietly. "What are you thinking about?" Shiwali looked up at him and smiled faintly. "Nothing. I just want to buy some books for him later." Oh, she can recognize a lot of words. Chapter 36-34. Shiwali shook her head. "Don't bother her. I like to go out and buy things myself. I want to buy some reference books, too." "Reference books?" Mulin raised an eyebrow. He had forgotten to ask her what she had been doing for a living these past few years. It seemed like she hadn't been down and out. Shiwali licked her lips. "I usually take on some translation jobs. You know I can't go around with Anan." He looked at her. "You don't have to work so hard in the future." She looked at him and said softly but firmly, "I like this job." He was a little unhappy. "You could take care of Anan better if you don't work." Shiwali stared at him for a long time before she smiled. "Do you ask Wen Yuan to do the same?" Mulin heard her mention Wen Yuan and remembered that he had promised Wen Yuan to go back for dumplings. It wasn't Wen Yuan, but Xiangnan. Xiangnan was going to America soon, and he couldn't go back on his promise. He paused. "Wen Yuan is different." He then added, "Wen Yuan is going abroad soon, and Xiangnan will go with him. I have to go back to the villa tonight." When he finished, he looked into her eyes. Shiwali was stunned for a moment. Then she put the book down and didn't say anything. She didn't have the right to say anything. His wife was Wen Yuan. Even if Xiangnan was Xiao Bai's child, his spouse was still Wen Yuan. She couldn't tell how she felt. She couldn't hate when Yuan either. Everything was her own choice. She was doing it for the Bai family, so she couldn't blame anyone, including Yumyulin. She didn't hate him, but he might have been blaming her all the time. She could feel it. Bai Shuali remained silent. Yumyulin lowered his voice. Don't you have anything to say? She shook her head. No. Then she looked up at him for a long time and smiled. That's your home. It's only right for you to go back. Yumyulin went forward and hooked his arm around her waist. Are you willing to be Bai Shuali's mistress? She glared at him, her eyes burning. Does Bossy want to divorce me and marry me? There was a faint smile in his eyes. If you bring it up, I'm not interested in destroying other people's families. She pushed him away. I have to clean up. Yumyulin did not pester her any further. Instead, he went to look at the books on the bookshelf. Did you translate all of them? She didn't say anything and didn't want to talk to him. He didn't think much of it. He took out a book and read it in Chinese, French, and English. Unexpectedly, her translation of the book was very accurate, and the emotions were also on point. Her ability to speak 8 languages was not just for show. He put down the book. If you go out, drive that white car. I've asked someone to maintain it regularly. Bai Shuali nodded and looked at him. Yumyulin, I have something to tell you. He looked like he was waiting for her to speak. Bai Shuali pursed her lips and said softly, we can get along in a different way. She looked at Nen, who was standing outside. Nen, you can see him anytime. We can be ordinary friends. Isn't that great? Yumyulin lit a cigarette. You want to be my friend? We just did it last night. Don't you think it's funny that you're crying under my body? She blushed. You forced me to do it last night. Chapter 36-35. He took a step forward and forced her into a corner. She had nowhere to retreat. He bent down and pressed his lips against her face. What if you have physical needs? She bit her lip and glared at him. After a while, she said, it's none of your business. He stared in her eyes and felt that her face was about to emit heat. Then he chuckled. Bai Shuali, I thought you were going to say that you didn't have physical needs. She was a little angry. Her slender hands gently tugged at his sweater, and she looked up into his eyes. Her voice was a little hoarse and charming. I thought you were worried about what I would do if I had physical needs in the next few years. His eyes were as dark as ink, and there was a hint of coldness in them. After a long time, he suddenly pinched her face. It hurts, it hurts, it hurts. Bai Shuali was in so much pain that she stared at him with tears in her eyes. Yumyulin's face was full of displeasure. Next time you make me unhappy, I won't let you hurt like this, huh? The hint in his words made her face burn again, but she didn't dare to stare at him. Yumyulin let go of her hand and looked around before whispering, I'll get off work early tomorrow to add some things. Yumyulin, I won't live with you outside of marriage. She emphasized, her face steaming. He leaned on the side. Do you think I won't get any benefits from supporting you? I can support myself, she immediately retorted. But Yumyulin frowned. I will let my woman go out and show her face in public. You can continue with your current work, but your biggest job is in me. His male chauvinist nature was clearly exposed. Bai Shuali was furious. I told you that I won't be your mistress. Well, then you'll support me, he said casually. I'll spend your money, so of course I have to work harder. Then he looked at an outside and lowered his voice. It's not to satisfy your needs. Bai Shuali felt that he wasn't like him at all, and even more unlike him outside. She continued to pack up and ignored him. Yumyulin didn't say much. He went to the kitchen and checked the fridge. It was still full. Then, he called someone to send some children's food. Later, he sat on the sofa with an in his arms and opened a top-notch home improvement store. He chose the decoration of the children's room, which was all original and could be lived in immediately. Tell me what you like. He held it in his arms, enjoying the feeling of a little girl in his arms. There was a faint smell on Anin's body, like the smell of a baby. It was different from her appearance, and his heart softened when he smelled it. Actually, he thought that he was originally very angry with Bai Shuali, but now he wasn't so angry anymore. He was angry because of this cute little thing. And looked at him. Can I do anything? Yumyulin ruffled her short hair. Yes, both are fine, but Daddy prefers the pink one. Little girls will be happier living in it. But I like blue. Bai Anan looked at him carefully and said dryly. Yu Mulin was startled, but he still smiled. Then it's fine if you like something else. Bai Anan looked at it for a long time, but he did not get impatient. Finally, Bai Anan pointed at a picture. I like this one. Chapter 36:36. I like you, Daddy. Bai Anan wrapped her arms around Yu Mulin's neck. She accepted him as her father easily. Maybe she was only like this in front of him. She was cool in front of others. Yu Mulin glanced at her and agreed in the end. As long as she liked it, he picked up the phone and booked it. He asked someone to come over to pack it up in a while. The bedding was a complete set. Still clinging to him, and then said softly, Daddy, you have to sleep with me. Yu Mulin was stunned. Otherwise, I wouldn't dare, Bai Anan said confidently. Yu Mulin sighed. Then why did you choose this one? Daddy's here, the little guy said without blushing or skipping a beat. He hugged him tightly with his little arms. Yu Mulin suddenly thought that if he wanted to sleep with Bai Xueli and wanted him to accompany her, what should he do? Hence, Misty picked up the phone again and ordered a set of children's furniture. It was pink and blue, so Bai Anan suddenly had 2 children's rooms. After hanging up the phone for less than an hour, the top-notch home improvement company came over. It took them more than 2 hours to finish the job and clean up the place. And was very happy. She stayed beside Yu Mulin and listened to the conversation between Yu Mulin and the rest of the people. She liked the last 2 rooms very much. When her father couldn't see, she secretly rolled around on the bed twice. Yu Mulin came over and happened to see it. The little girl immediately pretended not to care. He held back his laughter and walked over to sit by the bed, lying on the black bed sheet, and it made a face like a little devil. She said in a low voice, Daddy, can you sleep with me tonight? Yu Mulin thought for a while. Daddy will come back at 10 p.m., okay? And then happily rolled around again, but after a while, she felt a little embarrassed. He looked at her, and his heart softened. He felt that Anan was really a combination of him and Bai Xueli. He also lay over and hugged her. He put her in his arms and kissed her. However, Anan was like a little boy. After kissing her a few times, he felt that he was a little pervert. On the other hand, Anan was very clingy, rolling around his arms. Bai Xueli packed her things and came over to have a look. She was speechless when she saw the room. Then she looked at how Anan was clinging to Yu Mulin. She was still a little shocked. Anan was not a clingy child. She was close to Gu Changfeng, but she would never hug him like this. She looked at them, and Yu Mulin looked at her as well. It's getting late. Go and cook. He looked at the time. It was exactly 5 o'clock. After he was done, he could accompany Anan for dinner before going to the villa. Seeing that he was calm and composed, Bai Xueli snorted softly. Why am I the one cooking? I can do it as long as you accompany me to make love at night, he said naturally with one hand on the pillow. Beside him, Anan looked at him, a few words written on her face. What is love? Bai Xueli was furious. She bit her lips. Yu Mulin, can you be more shameless? Can you not lead the child astray? Little Anan looked at her again. She was furious. I'll go and cook. With that, she walked to the kitchen. She felt a little wronged. He was treating her like a tool for childbirth, a nanny, and even used her to warm the bed. She would be stupid to stay by his side. Chapter 36:37. Yu Mulin nodded. Yes, she is angry. He paused and said, but she will be fine after a little coaxing. But he still coaxed her to sleep first. It had been a day, and the 3-year-old had not slept at all. He turned his body sideways and placed her on his chest, coaxing her gently. He had coaxed Xiangnan before, so he was very good with children, and then curled up her little body and soon fell asleep peacefully. Her breath was fragrant and sweet. Yu Mulin slept with her for another 10 minutes before he got up and walked into the kitchen. The child's mother was still angry. In fact, she had been angry with him for almost 20 hours. He stood aside. Are you angry? It's obvious, isn't it? She cut the vegetables and glanced at him. You don't have to arrange a room for an inn. I want to bring her back to America next month. I'm only here to attend a book fair. Yu Mulin stared at her face. That's why you think it's okay to have sex with me once. I'm just your lover, as long as Gu Changfeng doesn't know about it. Right? Don't talk too much. It has nothing to do with him. Bai Xueli lowered her head and cut the vegetables. I won't be with him. It had been so many years, and she definitely wouldn't be with him in the future. She wasn't sure in the past, but now she was sure. If she were with Gu Changfeng, she would really kill him and the entire Gu family. Bai Shuili was still able to see this clearly. Yi Mulin looked at her side profile, and his expression softened. It's good that you know. Bai Shuili's hands stopped cutting the vegetables. She lowered her eyes and did not make a sound or move. Then her tears fell one by one. It was unexpected. Yi Mulin was also stunned. He pursed his lips and asked, "What's wrong?" Bai Shuili did not speak. He was too despicable. He bullied her. He was very good to very good to Wen Yuan, very good to Yi Xianan, but only to bully and coerce her. He called her by Xiao San, and she did not like it at all. She didn't have much ability, but she still had a little bit of backbone. Bai Shuili bit her lips, desperately trying not to cry out loud. Yi Mulin walked over. His tone wasn't very good. "Why are you crying? Isn't it just a meal?" She didn't say anything, so he added, "You're already a mother. Why you still cry so much?" "None of your business." She sniffed. "Was I the one who caused the separation? Was it my fault alone?" "Yi Mulin, you're too unfair." She couldn't help but cry. She squatted down and covered her face. Yi Mulin reached out his hand to pull her up, but he couldn't because she refused. She cried shamelessly, and he couldn't do anything about it. He could only ask in a low voice, "What do you want then?" She was still crying, and he couldn't do anything about it. He didn't want to admit his mistake, and he didn't want to let her go so easily, so he simply carried her and pressed her into a chair. She still wanted to cry. His body pressed against hers, and his voice was low and husky. "If you cry again, I'll do it with you right here. Do you want to sit on the chair or go to the wall?" "Bai Shuili, I'm telling you, it won't be very comfortable." She was so angry that she buried her face in his chest. Finally, she bit down hard on his chest. Chapter 36-38. Yi Mulin's heart ached, and the other part of his body ached even more. He wanted to kiss her. He tried to touch her lips. She was unwilling and turned her face away. Yi Mulin looked at her deeply and said in a low voice, "You don't like it when I kiss you?" She turned her face away, and there were still 2 drops of tears on her eyelashes. She looked very pitiful, but he still wanted to bully her. He pinched her chin and forced her to turn her head to look at him. Her eyes were watery, and she looked a little fragile. He sighed. She was already a woman in her early 30s, but she still looked like a little girl. She was about the same age as Wen Yuan, but Wen Yuan was already like a mother. He was mature and charming. Unlike her, she was already so old, but she was still as shallow as a little girl. But he liked little girls. His soft lips touched hers gently, and his other hand wiped away her tears. He said in a low voice, "I like you." His heart was suddenly filled with tenderness and mischief. He pinched her chin and said in a low voice, "Kiss me, Shuili." Her lips trembled, and she pursed them tightly. She was unwilling to take the initiative to kiss him. He could not help but kiss her. He rubbed his lips against hers, but he was patient and did not kiss her deeply. Instead, he was seducing and seducing her. Their lips rubbed against each other and touched each other gently. She did not close her eyes, but looked at him with her eyes wide open. He was also looking at her, testing her little by little. He pressed his lips against hers and placed his large palm on her back, slowly seducing her. Bai Shuili's throat moved and her lips were burning. She did not know what she should do. She did not want to respond to him, but she could not help but tilt her face up to meet his kiss. She did not know when her hands had wrapped around his neck. This kiss became wild. His hand pressed her back tightly and pulled her into his embrace. He rubbed her hard while she bit her lips. Other than not knowing what to do, she was also unable to restrain her emotions. Perhaps it was because she had suppressed it for too long. This kiss soon became hungry and thirsty, not only for him, but also for her. He only let go of her when he was satisfied. His unfathomable gaze became even deeper. He stared at her for a long time before he said in a hoarse voice, "Are you a little happier now?" She gasped softly, unable to utter a word. Yi Mulin's finger brushed past her slightly swollen red lips. It was a very suggestive gesture. He then smiled. "Let me cook." As he spoke, he walked to the counter. Bai Shuili's legs were still weak, and she looked at him in disbelief. His movements were swift, and he seemed to know what she was thinking. He said lightly, "Sometimes when I stay here, I cook for myself." He paused. What he didn't tell her was that he had always thought that one day she would come back and they would have a child of their own. He would take care of both mother and child, but he didn't expect that the child would already be there. Well, he did not have to spend time to make another one. Originally, he wanted a boy, but now that he was almost 40, there was no need. He had to spend time and energy. It was not convenient. As he cut the vegetables, his expression was especially gentle. Baishuli looked at him and said in a small voice, "Don't think that I'm willing to be your mistress just because you cooked a meal for me." His hand paused for a moment, and his voice was very soft. "If I cook for you every day and make love every day, would you be willing? I mean, sleeping together every night." Chapter 36-39. He had made it clear, but that pig brain didn't understand. Baishuli leaned against the chair and said softly, "I don't want to." There was a hint of anger in her tone, and there was also a hint of arrogance in it. Yimulin glanced at her and didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She was just a pig brain. He continued to cook. He made 3 dishes and a soup, which tasted good and was suitable for children. After he was done, he went back to his room to take a shower and change his clothes. Then he went to Ainan's bedroom to wake her up for dinner. Un was sleeping soundly. Yimulin sat by the bed and wanted to wake her up, but thinking of her young age, she hadn't slept well for a day and a night, so he dismissed the idea. He looked at his watch. It was already 6:30, so he took a coat and walked out. As he put it on, he said, "I'm going back to the villa. She's still sleeping. Wake her up for dinner later." Baishuli sat on the sofa and watched him put on his coat and take his car keys. No, he should call her home. She smiled reluctantly and didn't say anything, but the expression on her face revealed her true feelings. She couldn't hide them at all. Yimulin looked at her quietly. After a long while, he smiled faintly and left without saying anything. When the door closed, she hugged her legs and bit her lip. When Yimulin drove back to the villa, it was half an hour before 8. Xiangnan was playing on the sofa, bouncing up and down. He opened his arms when he saw Yimulin. "Uncle." Yimulin walked over and picked him up. "Did Xiangnan do well today?" Wen Yuan smiled. "Very well." And Xiangnan's English was very good too. He was praised. Xiangnan revealed a very proud expression. Yimulin pinched his little face. "Good. Our Xiangnan is really great." He took out a toy from behind. "Uncle gave it to me." Xiangnan was very happy and played with it in his hands. Yimulin chatted with Wen Yuan about going abroad. He was a little surprised when he found out that Wen Yuan would be leaving in a week. "Isn't it a little too rushed?" Wen Yuan shook his head. "It's because the school there invited me to study there. I thought about it carefully and decided that it's fine to go there earlier." Yimulin nodded and smiled. "It's good that you've decided." Wen Yuan looked at him. "You didn't come back last night because, well, Shirley's back," he said shortly. Wen Yuan was still a little surprised. After a while, he hesitated and said, "Should we make our divorce public? I'm afraid she'll misunderstand." "No need. You can go to the United States." Yimulin sighed. "Wen Yuan, take good care of Xiangnan. No matter what happens, I will take care of him." He was a little worried about Wen Yuan. With Mu Bai's current personality and the fact that he had lost his memories, he might be able to accept Xiangnan, but he would reject or even hate Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan nodded. "I know." In her heart, she was actually very grateful to Yimulin. In the past, she had always thought that he was a cold-blooded man. However, after spending time with him, she realized that he was not. She actually guessed that the reason why he was so soft was probably because of Baishuli's influence. In the past, Yimulin was not so kind. He was a very cruel and merciless person. Chapter 36-40. Yimulin ate dumplings at the villa and accompanied Xiangnan for a while before preparing to leave. When he left, he hugged Xiangnan and was about to leave when he suddenly turned to look at Xiangnan. Then he said to Wen Yuan, "Bring Xiangnan's jacket down. He has a fever. I'll take him to the hospital." Wen Yuan was also a little surprised. She reached out and touched Xiangnan's forehead gently. It was indeed a fever. She hurried upstairs and came down after a while to put the jacket on Xiangnan. Yulin carried the child and walked toward his car. Wen Yuan opened the car door and got in first to take Xiangnan. Xiangnan's fever was quite bad, so they didn't think too much and went straight to the hospital. The doctor said it was acute pneumonia, probably because of the air in the city these few days. The doctor then looked at Yulin and thought to himself, the leader's child still needs to be inhaled. Xiangnan was frightened. He lay quietly and said in a small voice, "Uncle, I'm scared." Yulin moved his head over and gently pressed it against Xiangnan's. "Don't be afraid, Xiangnan. He'll be fine as long as he takes the injection and medicine." When Yuan came back from talking to the doctor outside, and his expression relaxed a little. With Yulin's identity, Xiangnan naturally received the best treatment and care. She came in and reached out to touch Xiangnan's head. She lowered her voice and said to Yulin, "You go back first. I'll be fine here." Yulin said without thinking, "I'll stay and take care of him. I'll leave tomorrow morning." When Yuan disagreed, "Shueli just came back, and I didn't right? Don't let her misunderstand." Yulin smiled. It's okay to let her misunderstand. With that, he didn't say anything else. He just focused on feeding Xiangnan water. Xiangnan looked at him and said softly, "Is it an uncle's child?" "Yes." Yulin reached out and touched his little head. His voice was low and hoarse. "Xiangnan needs to get better soon. Otherwise, and is stronger and more handsome than you." Xiangnan smiled. It was a delicate smile with a kind of weak beauty. Yulin thought of his daughter and sighed in his heart. She really looked like a boy. He stayed for the whole night and remembered that he and Wen Yuan also had a recurring fever at night. Neither he nor Wen Yuan slept well. Although they weren't husband and wife, they had raised their child together, so he couldn't leave Wen Yuan alone. At 10 o'clock in the evening, he called by Shueli and told her that he wouldn't be coming back and asked her to tell him. He didn't explain anything else. But Shueli didn't ask him anything either. The two of them stared at each other in silence for a while before she said somewhat awkwardly, "I'll hang up then." After hanging up, Yulin smoked a cigarette in the corridor before returning to the ward. Xiangnan slept, and he asked Wen Yuan to sleep as well. The two of them took turns to take care of the child. Fortunately, Xiangnan's fever went down by dawn. Yulin heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he casually took a shower and gave some instructions to Wen Yuan. Then, he called the servants at home and asked them to prepare breakfast for Xiangnan. He also called the doctors at the hospital. Only then did he drive out of the hospital. He returned to the apartment. Because it was 7 in the morning, it was very quiet inside. He first went to the pink and blue room. He was sure then would sleep in it. Chapter 36:41. Children were easily forgetful. The little girl, who had been very angry last night, had long forgotten about it. She slept soundly like a little angel. Yulin sat down and gently touched her little face with his fingers. It was soft and tender. He smiled and his heart softened. He sat for a while and returned to the master bedroom. The mother was still asleep. She slept in the same position as lying on her side and holding a pillow in her hands. She looked indescribably childish. Yulin bent down and pinched her face. "Get up." Bai Shueli was woken up by him. She opened her eyes, which were a little bloodshot. He was startled and his voice was hoarse. "You slept late last night?" She closed her eyes again and hugged the pillow. "I translated late. Why are you here so early?" His voice was very soft. Xiangnan was hospitalized. His fever only subsided this morning. Bai Shueli's eyes opened a slit. "Shouldn't you stay in the hospital to take care of him? You still have to work?" Yulin rolled his eyes at her, as if what she said was stupid. She ignored him and hugged the pillow to sleep again. Yulin thought of something. It should be time for him to go to work. I'll ask Secretary Li to arrange a room and see which one is suitable. Bai Shueli's voice was vague. "No need." He glanced at her and then went to the changing room to pick out some clothes. He changed by the bed without avoiding her. He said mildly as he held the clothes, "Why not? And it is about the same age as Xiangnan." Bai Shueli buried her face in the pillow and then opened her eyes to talk to him. But when she opened her eyes, she saw that he was changing and she could see his six-pack. She bit her lip and felt a little incredulous. He was always in the office, socializing and reading endless documents. Where did he train his muscles? Yulin stared at her and smiled faintly. Didn't you say that you don't have any physical needs? Why are you looking at me for so long? Bai Shuili snorted softly. I've seen too many foreign movies. Yours is really nothing. Yulin frowned and then put down his clothes and walked towards her. Bai Shuili immediately sat up, hugged the quilt tightly, and screamed softly, "What are you doing?" He pinned her down and stared at her with an unfathomable gaze. His voice was low and husky. Haven't you seen it many times? What are you afraid of? As he said that, he pulled her hand over to feel his six-pack abs. It turned out that Bai Shuili had thought too much before. She had thought that he was going to be a hooligan. Although it was still considered a hooligan now, it was much better. However, the truth proved that she was thinking too much. It would be strange if he didn't act like a hooligan. Her hand was pressed down by him. She could feel his touch as she whispered, "Yulin, you bastard. Let go of me." He pressed her down and pressed his body against hers. How is it? She was stunned. What do you mean? He paused for a moment, then leaned close to her ear and whispered breathlessly, "Don't you suspect me, and when you on?" Bai Shuili was stunned again, and then blurted out, "Isn't it normal for you to have something going on with her?" They had been husband and wife for so long. She did not dare to think that they were still innocent. After she said that, his face darkened and he stared at her for a long time. Bai Shuili, you're really good. She couldn't understand why he was so angry, so she turned her face away. Let go. Chapter 3642. Bai Shuili lay back down, buried her face in the pillow, and looked at him. Can you handle it? Yulin didn't quite understand what she meant. What did she mean by, can I handle it? Bai Shuili looked at him. I mean, can you handle two families? He chuckled lightly, got up, and continued to put on his clothes. Bai Shuili, you can try. He paused for a moment. When Yuan and Xiangnan are going abroad soon, we won't bump into each other. The meaning behind his words was too hateful. Bai Shuili glared at him. Yulin chuckled lightly, put on his trousers and belt. Because he was going to work, he wore a white shirt and a dark coat. After putting it on, he sat down beside her and became serious. What did you say to him last night? About when Yuan and Xiangnan? She also sat up, not realizing that she was only wearing a thin silk pajamas. She hugged herself and asked softly, Yulin, what do you want me to say to her? Yulin stared at her eyes for a long time before he whispered, Bai Shuili, what do you want? She smiled and said helplessly, if I said that I don't want to be with you again, would you believe me? Then she said to herself, Yulin, I'm used to being alone, and it is used to not having a father. He looked down at her, his voice a little hoarse. Bai Shuili, do you want an to be without a father for the rest of her life? She's very independent. She tried to reason with him. Yulin smiled coldly. But she knows that I'm her father now. His fingers gently stroked her little face. You want me to divorce and marry you, huh? Actually, it didn't matter. As long as she wanted it, he could do it. He didn't need her to say it. He had already divorced her. How could he bear to let her suffer? But she really dared to think so badly of him. She thought that he wanted to have the best of both worlds. Did she think that all these years, he just casually got together with Wen Yuan because of his physical needs? Wen Yuan's child was Mubai's. Was he so immoral in her heart? He reached out and pinched her chin. He wanted to crush it, but he held back. Bai Shuili didn't fall for his trick. She said with a cold face, Yulin, what's wrong with you? I didn't ask you to divorce me and marry me. He looked at her for a long time and suddenly said, You're still the same as before, pig brain. She got even angrier and argued with him. He impatiently leaned over and kissed her, his voice hoarse. If you dare to say another word, I'll make you unable to get off the bed. Bai Shuili was stunned for a moment. How could he be like this? She glared at him and bit her lip. Her face seemed to be on fire. He smiled and bit her lips. When a man quarreled with a woman, he could act like a hooligan if he couldn't win an argument. He could even get physical. In short, the woman would always be the one at a disadvantage in the end. Bai Shuili didn't dare to continue arguing with him. She curled up at the head of the bed and suddenly remembered something. Where's little Xiao Bai? It's been made into tortoise soup. Yi Mulin caressed her red lips, his voice hoarse. If it weren't for the fact that he had to go to work, he wouldn't have let her go. Although they had done it after they reunited, he had been single for almost a year. How could one night be enough? Chapter 3643. Bai Shuili glared at him, unable to believe that he had really scalded Little White like a tortoise. She stared at him, then tears welled up in her eyes, but she stubbornly refused to let them fall. He looked at her with a faint smile. After a long time, she finally squeezed out a sentence. Yi Mulin, I hate you to death. Just as he was about to say something, she had already reached out and slapped him away, accidentally hitting his face. She had slapped the chief. Yi Mulin stared at her face for a while and said coldly, You haven't changed at all. You haven't either. You're still so cruel. She was angry that he had stewed Little White. Although she was a little scared, she still had the guts to look at him. Yi Mulin looked at her, not caring about his face that had been slapped. He snorted lightly and got up. He looked like he was angry. Bai Shuili didn't care about him. She didn't want to admit that he was wrong. It was his fault that he had killed Little White. He was a bad person. Yi Mulin was a little angry. He was a man, a powerful man, and he had been slapped by his wife. He shook his head. She hadn't changed at all. He always had work to do, so he had to go to work. When the powerful man got into the car, he called Secretary Li and asked her to bring breakfast. Actually, thinking about it, he was really despicable. He asked for it. He didn't even get to eat breakfast, and he even got slapped. She believed him when he said he had stewed Xiao Xiao. She was really stupid. Yi Mulin's car stopped downstairs of the general office. He called Wen Yuan again and asked about Xiang Nan's situation. Then he got out of the car and walked into the general office. Along the way, everyone who saw him called Yi Mulin. In the apartment, Bai Shuili looked at her hand and muttered, Stingy. It was just an accident. However, did he really kill Xiao Xiaobai? She sat there in a daze for a while, then her eyes reddened. Just as she was in a daze, and then woke up and ran over barefooted from the children's room. Mom. Bai Shuili came back to her senses and hugged her little body. Bai Anan wrapped her arms around her neck and stared at her for a long time before saying softly, Is Dad back? Bai Shuili was stunned again. She didn't expect Anan to care so much about this, so she forced a smile and said, I came back, but Dad was very busy with work. Anan asked again, hugging her even tighter, Mom, are we still going abroad? Bai Shuili's voice shook, and then she whispered, Anan, do you want to stay? Anan leaned on her shoulder and said very softly, I like Daddy. Bai Shuili felt a little sad. She patted Anan. You can still come back to see him in the future. Anan had always been like a boy. She didn't act coquettishly, but this time, she rubbed against her mother's chest. I want to be with Daddy. She was talking about being together for a long time. Bai Shuili was stunned. Then, she sighed in her heart. She was at a loss. Perhaps it was a mistake to take the job back home this time. She thought that it would be fine to come back for half a month. She thought that he would forget about her once he had a family. Nothing was important anymore. They would never cross paths again. Chapter 3644. On the second day after she returned to the country, he had already dragged her to bed. She didn't say if he had forced himself on her, but she knew very well if she had really resisted. Bai Shuili reached out and patted him, comforting her gently for a while. Luckily, Anan wasn't a very pretentious girl. She just expressed her thoughts to her mother and then left the decision to the adults. In this aspect, it was indeed very worry-free. Bai Shuili carried her up and then went to brush their teeth and wash their faces. Then, she made breakfast for him and then sat down and ate breakfast. She looked at Bai Shuili and suddenly said, Mommy, I want to go to the nursery. Bai Shuili was stunned. Then, she asked her, You don't like to be with Mommy? If I go to the nursery, Mommy will have a lot of time to herself. And then spoke fluently. Bai Shuili looked at her. Is it your own idea, or did Daddy teach you? Daddy taught me. Bai Anan easily betrayed her father. Bai Shuili was speechless, but she couldn't say too much to Anan, and was very attached to this father of hers. After breakfast, she tidied up and brought Anan out to go to the bookstore. When she went to get her purse, she found a card on the bedside table. It looked quite familiar. She walked over and reached out to pick it up. Then, her eyes felt a little warm. She had used this card before. In the past, when she and Yimulin had just gotten married, he had given it to her. Then, after she left him, he left it here. What did he mean by putting it here again? She looked at it for a long time until an imp pulled her. Then, she came back to her senses and let it out. Because it was past the morning rush hour, there weren't many people on the subway. Baishuali brought and to find a place to sit down. Then, she looked at the platform and taught and how to look. If it was the old Baishuali, she wouldn't take the subway. She felt that everywhere was filled with the smell of cheap goods. She would always travel in a top-of-the-line sports car. She wanted to be as high-profile as possible. But now, she felt that this was pretty good. She didn't drive that BMW. Subconsciously, she didn't want to become a woman who was completely kept by Yimulin. She didn't want to use his card either. She would feel that she would lose her self-esteem. The subway arrived at the station she wanted to go to. She got off and took it out of the platform to find the bookstore she was looking for. The bookstore was very big and wanted to read about children's science. She took a book and sat on the sofa obediently. Baishuali was looking for reference books on the other side. When it was overseas, she often read in the bookstore. She would look for information and stay there for the whole morning. However, to everyone's surprise, there was a customer who was wearing the same clothes as Baishuali today. She bought a book and walked out. Anin saw her and immediately got up to chase after her. The long legs in front of her were walking very fast. Anin called for her mother a few times, but did not stop. Soon, she was lost. Anin stood on the streets of B City. Looking at the unfamiliar environment, she burst into tears. I don't usually cry. I want to be stubborn, but I'm really scared. Anin burst into tears. Coincidentally, a traffic policeman came over and squatted down. Little girl, did you get lost with your parents? Anin looked at the pretty traffic police officer and nodded shyly. Then big sister will take you to find mom, okay? Can you tell me where you got lost? The traffic police lady asked patiently. Chapter 36:45. The traffic police lady looked in the direction of her little finger and was stunned. It was Nocturnal Chieftain. No, Nocturnal Chieftain's family had been interviewed before. It wasn't this one at that time. Thus, she said patiently, "This is Nocturnal Chieftain. It's Dad," and then said stubbornly. The traffic police lady was speechless and looked at her, and also looked at her. After a long time, the traffic police lady coughed lightly. A lying child will be taken away by a big bad wolf. And then bit her lip and said with tears in her eyes, "It's Dad, he's not lying." The traffic police lady looked at Anin's temperament. Although there weren't a lot of bodyguard around her, this baby looked very noble. And that face really looked 70% similar to the top 5 most powerful men in B City. However, this was Nocturnal Chieftain's child. Didn't that mean that Nocturnal Chieftain had an affair? The traffic police lady felt that this matter was quite serious, so she asked her superior for advice. She held the precious baby in one hand and the phone in the other. "Director Lin, I found a child on the road. He said that Nocturnal Chieftain is his father. Throw him into the rescue station," Chief Lin said without hesitation. The traffic police nodded and then looked at Anin sympathetically. However, Director Lin thought about it and made another call that he didn't think was very important. "What's the child's surname? What's his mother's name?" The traffic police lady perked up and asked again. Anin's eyes were like black beans. "My surname is Bai. My mother's name is Baishuali." Director Lin heard it, and then his body softened. Fuck, what kind of shit was this? It seemed to be a great merit, but Baishuali was Nocturnal Chieftain's ex-wife. This child was an illegitimate child. He definitely couldn't send it over directly, or the chief would be angry. As a superior, no one liked their disgraceful privacy to be exposed. Director Lin was worried, and at the same time wanted to show his merit. He first called Nocturnal Chieftain and felt that this was the most appropriate. When Director Lin called the general office, the operator outside first picked up the call. Then, it was Secretary Lee. Secretary Lee was his trusted aide. After Director Lin spoke, Secretary Lee was stunned. Then, he asked him to take care of the child. He didn't hang up the call and went straight to the small conference room. At this moment, Yi Mulin was having an internal meeting with more than 10 subordinates. Secretary Lee came in with a strange expression and whispered something in his ear. Yulin looked at her a little surprised, but soon made a decision. Let him send it in to me. Secretary Lee asked softly. Aren't we going to inform Miss Bai? After all, she might be nearby. What she didn't dare to say was that this was the general office. Did her boss want everyone to know that he had such an illegitimate child outside? Yulin only said lightly, just do as I say. Secretary Lee replied with an, oh, and immediately went to do it. He told Director Lin, the chief asked you to send an over. He's in a meeting right now. He might be able to spare 5 minutes to entertain you. Director Lin was deeply grateful. He was excited to death, but he also felt conflicted. Secretary Lee, do you think I should send the young master off grandly or quietly? Chapter 3646. After Secretary Lee finished speaking, Chief Lin pulled the little noble person over with some disbelief. He looked at it from left to right and felt that it was still a little boy. Instead, the young traffic policeman said softly, she's actually very delicate. Chief Lin, look at her facial features. She's especially beautiful. Chief Lin looked at it and nodded. It's very nice. Thinking about it, how could the daughter of the night chieftain's daughter not be good-looking? My goodness, I've always thought that Nocturnal Chieftain is a very upright person, but it turns out that he also enjoys the fortune of having 2 wives. Chief Lin despised them in his heart, but he still had to flatter them on the surface. After weighing the pros and cons, he decided to personally send them over. Of course, the little traffic policeman would have to record the merit, a great merit. When he got into the car, he said, go to my office tomorrow. You don't have to work so hard outside anymore. Girls should find a suitable position. The little policeman exclaimed at his heart. He went over to Huggin and gave her a kiss. They really were few, and wasn't afraid. She was taken away by Chief Lin just like that. Along the way, the police car cleared the way. Chief Lin even specially got out of the car to buy a child's favorite snacks to coax her. After the car arrived at Yulin's office, Yulin was directly brought to Secretary Lee. Secretary Lee hugged and kissed her. You look just like your mother. Bai Anan looked at Secretary Lee. I want Dad. And he will take you there now. Secretary Lee liked Anan very much. Her feelings were different from others. She had been Yulin's secretary since he was still Lawyer Yi. She was still his secretary now. She had been Yulin's secretary for more than 10 years. Just when Secretary Lee was about to go over, Yulin had already finished his team meeting. A group of people walked out of the conference room. He walked in front, looked at Anan and smiled. Anan was stunned. She immediately rushed over and hugged his leg. Daddy! Yulin did not avoid the others. He reached out and picked Anan up. His tone was very gentle. Where's Mommy? Anan blinked her big eyes. Anan lost Mommy. Mommy ran away. Yulin coughed softly. Mom is an adult now. She won't get lost. Tears welled up in Anan's eyes. But I can't find her. Yulin sighed and remembered by Shiwili in his heart. He would definitely teach her a lesson when he returned. She had lost the child when she went out with him. She had not realized it yet, right? He turned to look at Secretary Lee. Call Bai Shiwili and tell her that Anan is here. Bai Shiwili? Secretary Lee stuck out her tongue. What a distant form of address. Yulin glared at her, and she left immediately. She even looked at the group of leaders behind Yulin. Everyone had a complicated expression on their faces because this kind of thing was common. However, it was rare to see someone like Yulin who exposed his private life to the public. No, it had never happened before. Looking at the way Nocturnal Chieftain was holding the child, his heart was really in pain. Chief Lin carefully smiled along. Today is also a coincidence. Yulin looked at Anan and asked softly, why is it like this? Bai Anan looked at him blankly. I don't know what Dad means. You clearly remember Mommy's phone number, don't you? Yulin's hand patted her little but gently. Naughty, and reached out and hugged his neck. She buried her little face in his, and her voice was muffled. I just miss Daddy. Chief Lin's heart skipped a beat. Ah, had he been fooled by this brat? Chapter 3647. Although Director Lin was cursing in his heart, he didn't dare to say it out loud. He didn't dare to show any unhappiness on his face. What a joke! How could he not be happy? He really wanted to cry. While Director Lin was feeling sad, Bai Anan was hugging her father. Her little body was in his arms, her arms hugging him tightly. Yi Mulin whispered a few words to Secretary Li. Secretary Li smiled and welcomed Director Lin. The other subordinates didn't dare to say too much. They just looked at them and praised how cute they were. Yi Mulin carried Bai Anan into his office without any hesitation. Along the way, he received many gazes. This isn't the only child of Chief Yi. This one looks cuter. It looks more like Chief Yi. It's his ex-wife's child. His ex-wife is beautiful. I heard that they were together for a few years after their divorce. It's true love. A true love that can't be broken up by family and power. They only dared to speak softly. How would they dare to let Yi Mulin hear them? However, he was going to be gossiped about since he was carrying an Anan in public. He carried an Anan. An Anan's sharp ears caught a word. She asked softly, "Daddy, what's an ex-wife?" Yi Mulin smiled. An ex-wife is a wife who was together in the past, but was forced to separate because they weren't suitable for each other. Everyone present froze. Yi Mulin stood still and asked the little fellow in his arms, "Is there anything else you want to ask?" An Anan looked at him with her big black eyes. She asked softly, "Was Mommy not suitable or was it forced?" Not only did an Anan want to know, everyone present pricked up their ears. Yi Mulin looked at an Anan and smiled. His voice was slightly hoarse. "I had no choice." An Anan replied with an "oh." After a long pause, she asked again, "Does Daddy still like Mommy?" "Daddy likes you too." This time, Yi Mulin answered in a different way. The child didn't quite understand. However, the gossips around them were clear. It was clear that Chief Yi couldn't forget his ex-wife. He liked her very much. After Yi Mulin finished speaking, he walked into his office. Before he closed the door, he said to Secretary Li, "Call by Shueli over." Secretary Li's heart skipped a beat. He felt that when the words by Shueli came out of the bureau chief's mouth, every word sounded different. She immediately dismissed Director Lin and called by Shueli to tell her that An was here. On the other side, Bai Shueli was naturally very confused. She didn't even realize that she had rushed over after paying the bill. Yi Mulin's office was an independent building. The hundreds of people in this building were all his subordinates. Before Bai Shueli rushed over, almost everyone knew that Yi Mulin had an illegitimate child. When she arrived, Secretary Li was waiting downstairs and welcomed her in. "Secretary Li, how did An come here?" Bai Shueli frowned, feeling a little anxious. Secretary Li smiled. "I don't know what's going on. I only know that Director Lin of the Transportation Bureau personally sent it. Surely, don't worry. An is fine now. She's with the chief." It was because of this that Bai Shueli was worried. She realized that An was very attached to Yi Mulin. She was so persistent that she didn't know what An's reaction would be if she took An abroad. Chapter 3648. Bai Shueli nodded and Secretary Li winked at her. "I'll bring you a cup of lemon tea." "Thank you." Secretary Li closed the door just as Bai Shueli finished speaking. She turned her head. The office in front of her was huge and simple, but every piece of furniture was especially heavy. The floor was covered with a low-key woolen carpet. Beside the wall was a large bookcase with a leather sofa. Opposite them was a large office desk. There was an ornament on it that Bai Shueli could recognize. It had been sold for tens of millions at an auction, and he had actually placed it here. Was he not afraid that someone would come and check on him? Yi Mulin was sitting on the sofa, patiently feeding An snacks. He heard the noise and glanced at Bai Shueli. Then, he said calmly, "You came pretty fast." There was a hint of mockery in his tone. Bai Shueli could obviously hear it, but it wasn't the time to be calculated with him. She walked over and squatted down to look at An. "Why are you here?" An looked at her and pouted. Mommy ran away, and the baby couldn't catch up to Mommy. Bai Shueli felt strange. Mommy didn't leave. Mommy was there the whole time. An said stubbornly, "Mommy just left, and the baby was crying on the street." Bai Shueli wanted to say something, but Yi Mulin's tone was low. "There was someone in the bookstore wearing the same clothes as you." She walked out, and then mistook you for her. This was from the surveillance footage, and it showed how careless Bai Shuili was as a mother. Bai Shuili was stunned for a moment, and then she felt a little scared. As a mother, which mother wouldn't worry about the safety of their child? Bai Shuili was prepared to beat Bainan up. She used to spank her when she was disobedient. But just as she was about to do that, Yim Yulin pulled her over. In a split second, she was lying on his lap. It was warm, and there was an indescribable secret feeling. Bai Shuili was stunned for a moment before she screamed, "Yim Yulin, what are you doing? You're crazy, you jerk. Let go of me." His fingers caressed her gently, and his voice was hoarse. Shouldn't I be punished for doing something wrong? She knew what he was thinking. She closed her eyes and screamed, "Yim Yulin, you're too despicable. Do you think I don't know that you hit my dick to satisfy your perverted thoughts?" By shares? Perverted thoughts? Bai Anan leaned against her papa and asked in a low voice, "What do you mean by perverted thoughts?" Even at this time, Yim Yulin still had the heart to answer his daughter's question. That's what Daddy thinks when he's facing Mommy." What kind of explanation was that? Bai Shuilan was furious. She tried her best to roll her eyes and glare at him, but he had already slapped her. But Bai Shuili was already in her early 30s, and she had even been beaten up by her ex-husband. If word of this got out, it would be very embarrassing. She shouted angrily, "Yim Yulin, you bastard! Let go of me! Let go of me!" He did not let go and pressed her down, saying to Anan, "Do you want to be punished for doing something wrong?" Anan didn't dare to pick a side, but Yim Yulin gave her courage. She gulped and said carefully, "I want to buy stocks." Bai Anan. Bai Shuia gritted her teeth. Chapter 36:49. It hurts. Yim Yulin, you bastard, you're hurting me. She screamed at first and then started crying. She cried sadly and embarrassedly, especially when Secretary Lee came in with tea and saw the cruel scene. He quickly left. She was hit by him, and others saw it. Yim Yulin looked in the direction of the door, then looked at the cat urine on her face and Anan's curious gaze. So he said in a low voice, "Anan, go to the lounge." Bai Anan looked at him curiously and felt sorry for her mother. She said softly, "Dad, do you have that kind of perverted thought now?" Yim Yulin had hit her. His fingers gently caressed the place where she had been hit. He smiled. "You have to ask Mom later." Anan looked at the smile on his face and felt that her father didn't seem to be that angry. So she was relieved and ran to the lounge, leaving a gap to peek. "Bai Anan." Yim Yulin's voice was heard. "Don't peek." "Oh," Anan said in a regretful tone. Yim Yulin looked at the door, and then his hand went into the sweater. He was a little dissatisfied through the clothes. When he touched the place where she was hit, her body trembled and she cried, "Yim Yulin, you've already hit me. What else do you want?" He leaned over and pressed his lips against her shoulder, gently nibbling on it. Then he nibbled all the way to the back of her ear. His voice was so hot that it was as if he had a mouthful of sand. "You can't hit me after doing something wrong." His voice was harsh against her ear, but if his hand hadn't been so wicked, she would have thought he was really angry. But his hand, she was sure that he was making use of it. She struggled for a while. "Yim Yulin, don't move. Don't move." Yim Yulin didn't stop. As he tortured her, he whispered in her ear, "Does it hurt?" She cried in pain. "It hurts." "What does it hurt?" His voice sounded like he was coaxing her, but it sounded very disgusting to her ears. He did it on purpose, but if she didn't say it, he had a way to make her say it. When he spoke, his hot breath blew on her ear. It was painful and itchy, like ice and fire. "Yim Yulin, stop." She couldn't help but cry. She was deliberately disfigured by him, and he was neatly dressed on the sofa in his office. She wondered when the man had become so obscene. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get away from him. In the end, she couldn't take it anymore and could only cry on his lap. She felt ashamed, and was just a wall away, and she was made to be like this by him. She cried and murmured, "Do you treat other women like this here?" He hit her. It hurt so much that she gasped for air as she cried. Yim Yulin was supposed to be a punishment, but he was a little tempted by it. In addition to the feeling in his hands, he really wanted it. However, when he thought about how Anan was inside, He held back no matter how hard he tried. His voice was hoarse. Other women didn't give birth to my child. Why would I hit them? She cried so miserably that her tears stained his pants. It was wet and cold, making him uncomfortable. Chapter 3650. Yulin lowered his head to look at her tears, his voice a little low. Do you know fear now? If it didn't meet Chief Lin's people today, but a bad guy, would you still have the chance to sit here and get beaten up? She was stunned. His voice became stern again. Shueli, and it only has us as her parents. She's gone and can't be found. We can have another child, but she won't have the chance. Do you understand? Her lips moved. She's fine here. Yulin, I've been living like this for the past few years. That's good. You haven't even realized your mistake. His face turned cold. Bai Shueli shook her head. That's not what I meant. I mean, I might not be a good mother, but are you a good father, Yulin? Or do you think that I can choose many things? He stared at her for a while before saying softly, Bai Shueli, you can't choose, but do you think I can? How can I choose if you're gone? You can choose not to marry when you on, she said a little angrily. After saying that, she froze and turned her face away awkwardly. They were blaming each other like this. It was as though the past had been torn open and everyone was in pain. Bai Shueli refused to speak anymore. He looked at her and asked softly, Bai Shueli, do you blame me? She lowered her eyes. I don't. I blame myself. He looked at her coldly and then put her down. He walked to the resting room to comfort Anan. That child who peeked must be scared out of her wits. Anan was scared out of her wits. Even though her mother was crying, she thought that it was her father bullying her mother, just like children bullying each other. But then they started talking and it didn't seem right. Her father was angry, and so was her mother. They were ignoring each other. Was this a fight? Anan's face fell. When Yulin walked over to her, she ran to the sofa and sat down. The baby didn't peek. Yulin walked over and squatted in front of Anan, smiling. Anan, every pair of parents will fight. Will others have perverted thoughts too? Anan asked in a low voice. She just wanted to know if her parents were the same as others, because since she was young, her father was not around, so she felt that it was different. Yulin hesitated for a moment, then smiled faintly and reached out to caress her little face. There will be. Daddy loves you too. It's just that I didn't know you existed before. Anan used to be very dependent on him, but now she was a little suspicious. He knew it was because he bullied Bai Shueli, and was raised by Bai Shueli, so of course he was close to her now, and it still looked at him warily. Then she ran out of the bedroom and ran outside. Yulin hugged her from behind, and the little girl was carried back, and Anne's little body wriggled around like a caterpillar. I want to be with Mommy. She was always a child, and when she saw that her father was not the same as he had been yesterday, she burst into tears. Yulin was a little confused. Yesterday's baby was different from today's baby, and the baby just now was different from today's baby. She had started to dislike him so quickly. Chapter 3651. Yulin comforted her. Mommy is here. But Mommy cried too. Anan cried very sadly, fully showing Bai Shueli's strong genes. Then Yulin understood that this girl looked like him, but in fact, it was all a lie. In her bones, she was a small Bai Shueli, smart but not on the right path. She only knew how to act coquettishly. However, he had a feeling of surviving a disaster. It seemed that he was very glad that she was like this. The little girl he wanted was like her. It was not good to be too independent. Girls needed to be coaxed by men. Yulin had endless patience for the little girl. He squatted down and reached out to pinch her soft little face. His voice was unbelievably gentle. Then if Daddy coaxes Mommy and Mommy stops crying, can I not cry too? She raised her little face and looked at him. Then the baby has to think about it. Anyway, she couldn't just agree to him casually. Yulin chuckled and kissed her. Then Daddy will go and coax Mommy, okay? She looked at him and said fiercely, don't hit Mommies but any more. Okay. He made a pinky promise with her. Can Anan forgive Daddy? Bao still needs to think about it. Anan wasn't fooled. He was extremely arrogant and unreasonable. But Yi Mulin felt that it was good. After his daughter was spoiled, the boy couldn't stand her bad temper and wouldn't be easily cheated away. He kissed her again and walked out. He saw that the child's mother was still crying. She probably didn't want to scare Ainin, so she didn't go in. Yi Mulin adjusted his tie, walked over and sat down. He reached out and put his arm around her shoulder. "Are you still angry?" Bai Shuli pushed his hand away. Her voice was nasal. It was obvious that she had been crying for a long time. "It's none of your business. Ainin and I will go back to America." He looked at her. Go back to America and continue to be a little translator to earn money to support Ainin. What kind of life can you give her? It wasn't that he looked down on her, but he felt sorry for her. She used to like to spend money so much. These years must not be very rich. So he was angry but also distressed. Bai Shuli looked up at him and smiled. "Yes, I can't earn much money, but at least I can let Ainin live a normal life." He looked at her. Bai Shuli continued, "The first year I went to America, I washed dishes at a Chinese restaurant when I was with Huayan." Yi Mulin was stunned for a moment, then looked at her in shock. Bai Shuli hugged herself and turned her head to look at him. "I worked 14 hours a day to earn dozens of dollars to pay the rent and to give birth to an in a proper hospital. Things are so much better now than they were back then." After Yi Mulin recovered from his shock, he whispered, "Even if you wanted to leave, you would have brought money with you. Why didn't you?" "I did." She bit her lower lip, but someone stole it. This time, he didn't know what to say. He couldn't hit her, nor could he scold her. He could only comfort her because he was still angry at her. She can't even take care of herself. How can she take care of an inn? Bai Shuli turned her face away and said in a low voice, "Yi Mulin, I can take care of myself. You've seen that I'm doing well these past few years. So good that you lost an inn after coming back for a few days?" He looked at her coldly. Bai Shuli couldn't help but say, "It was an accident." Chapter 3652. Yi Mulin was angry, and his tone was not very good. Bai Shuli was stunned for a moment, and then turned her face away. She was angry, but more than that, she felt wronged. Yes, she was not good enough, but she was like this, and she had worked very hard. She thought she was very good now, but he still looked at her as if she was useless. She didn't talk to him when she was angry, and tears fell from her face. It was not like the kind of awkwardness before, but she really felt very wronged, and there was a feeling of breaking up with him, never to see him again in this life. It was not that she didn't feel anything when they met again, but it was also strange. In addition to being Wan Yuan's husband, it was also because of his power. She felt oppressed in this office, and she finally had to admit to herself that this man was no longer the previous Yi Mulin. She lowered her eyes, and tears fell one by one, dripping on the back of her hand, but she did not wipe them. She was unwilling, and still wanted to save face. Yi Mulin stared at her eyes, and then fell on the back of her hand. He knew that she would lose her temper, but he did not expect that she would cry like a child. Just as he was about to say something, Secretary Li pushed the door open and came in, followed by a politician. As soon as the two saw the situation inside, they hurriedly left. Yi Mulin raised his eyes and glanced at the little girl who was crying a little hard. His voice was much gentler. "You're a mother, but you still like to cry so much. And then we'll laugh at you." She still twisted her face and said a little willfully and angrily, "And we'll give it to you. I'll go by myself." Yi Mulin reached out a finger to lift her chin. She wanted to slap it away angrily, but he quickly pinched her chin, and Junyan leaned over and whispered, "Angry." Her face was hiding, but he just had a way to pinch it. The more she dodged, the stronger his strength became. In the end, a fingerprint was pinched on her chin, and it was green and purple. Yi Mulin let go of his hand and laughed. He reached out and dragged her into the bathroom, pressing her shoulders from behind to look in a mirror. She refused, but he was too strong. He turned his face around, almost touching her face, and said, "Put ice on it, or others will think that I force you to do special service just now." Special service? Bai Shuli was stunned for a moment before she came back to her senses. She stared at him and said, "Yi Mulin, you're too despicable." He was still sticking close to her face as he chuckled lowly. How am I hateful? If I was really hateful, I would have forced you to serve me. With tears in her eyes, she looked at the two people in the mirror, a little shocked. He smiled again. What's so strange about it? All men like this, and I'm no exception. Baishuli was still staring blankly at the mirror. After a long time, she squeezed out a sentence. Yi Mulin, you are too shameless. He stared at her for a moment, then smiled. Is that so? She lowered her eyes. You are so busy and old. Why are you still thinking about these things? After talking for a long time, he didn't reply. She looked up and froze for a moment. Yi Mulin's eyes were fixed on her reflection in the mirror. His gaze was terrifying. She was stunned. He smiled. I'm old, aren't I? As he spoke, he gently rubbed the bruise on her chin with his fingers and said meaningfully, Let's try it tonight. Shirley bit her lips. Chapter 36:53. He carried her into the lounge. Sleep with an inn for a while. Let's have lunch together. I'll take you back at night. She got down and looked down. Aren't you going to the hospital? Oh, he said as if he had just thought of it. You're right. You can go with me then. I'm not going. Baishuli's reaction was quite fierce. Yi Mulin looked at her and smiled gently. He didn't say anything else. He just kissed her. Mom won't be angry anymore if you coax her. The baby won't be angry either, okay? Baishuli then realized that he was just coaxing her because of Nun. She was so angry that she kicked his leg. He reached out and pressed her down. He looked straight into her eyes. You will lead an astray. She's fine. Baishuli's eyes were red. Yi Mulin smiled and leaned over to say something to Anin. He straightened up and looked at Baishuli again. Then he walked out and closed the door. The lounge was quiet. There were only the mother and daughter. Anin looked at Baishuli and moved her little body over. Baishuli looked at her. Numb. And Anne's little body crawled over and hugged her. She didn't say anything. She just hugged her. Her heart softened. She pressed her face against Anne's. She felt a little wronged and afraid. She said in a low voice, and then, Mom will be more careful in the future. And then whimpered and hugged her tightly. It was considered that they had reconciled. At noon, Yi Mulin asked Secretary Li to send lunch over. They ate in the small dining room. The lunch was rich, and there were desserts that children love to eat. Baishuli didn't think it was appropriate. She said while eating, I'll take it back later. Yi Mulin looked at her and smiled. Why? Don't you want to stay here? Are you afraid that others will gossip? You know it. Her voice was excited at first, but then it became softer. After all, she was afraid that An would hear something. Later, Baishuli felt that this topic was a little boring. She felt a little embarrassed and didn't continue. Yi Mulin looked at her and seemed to think for a moment. I'll ask the driver to send you back. I'll go back at night. It doesn't matter if you don't go. She added. Actually, it was only natural. Since Xiangnan was sick, even if he wasn't Xiangnan's father, he was still the one who raised him and was the father in name. As she said this, Yi Mulin looked at her strangely and then smiled. He didn't say whether he would reply or not. He just pinched Anan's little face, and then looked up at him. Yi Mulin smiled, hugged, and kissed her. Daddy will be home tonight. He said go home. The meaning behind it was quite profound. He worked in the afternoon. Baishuli took him back in the chauffeur's car. When the chauffeur returned, Yi Mulin took the time to make a call. Have you sent her home? The driver nodded. Yes. Don't worry, Chief. He's already here. Yi Mulin hung up and immediately called Yi Mubai. Mubai, are you still in B City? Yi Mubai was at the airport and was about to return to the United States. As he walked, he asked, Brother, what's the matter? Chapter 36:54. Yi Mubai was stunned for a moment. Is Xiangnan sick? Yi Mubai nodded. I'm a little worried. I've been busy these days, so only when Yuan can take care of Xiangnan. Yi Mubai paused. Then I'll stay for a few more days. Yi Mubai smiled. That couldn't be better. After hanging up the phone, he dealt with the business for the whole afternoon. At 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, he went back to the villa to take some things and went to the hospital to see Xiangnan. Xiangnan was fine, but he needed to stay in the hospital for a few days. When he said goodbye to Wen Yuan, Yi Mubai happened to come over. Brother, Won't you stay in the hospital to accompany Xiangnan tonight? Yi Mubai paused. No, I have a meeting in another city tomorrow, so I have to leave early in the morning. Yi Mubai looked at him and then at Wen Yuan. He always felt that the relationship between the couple was not that close, although he had seen them being intimate. He couldn't tell, but it was probably a man's intuition. He stood side by side with Wen Yuan and watched Yi Mubai's car drive away. Then his eyes fell on Wen Yuan's face. You won't keep him? Wen Yuan also withdrew her eyes and lightly looked at his face. He has a job. Yi Mubai didn't know what was wrong with him, but he felt that her reaction was too cold and emotionless. He frowned. Aren't you worried that he has a woman outside? Wen Yuan smiled lightly. He's very busy, so he may not have time. Yi Mubai's expression was slightly cold. Then you'll be the next my parents, and it will end with a divorce. Then he said sarcastically, do you love him? Or do you only love his power? Or is it just a marriage? Wen Yuan's voice was a little cold. Yi Mubai, you've crossed the line. She wanted to enter the ward, but Yi Mubai stopped her. He stared at her eyes and said in a low voice, was it also a task when you accompanied him to bed? Wen Yuan took 2 steps back and looked at him in surprise. Then she said in a hoarse voice, you have no right to ask, and I won't tell you. She walked around him, wanting to open the door. However, his hand covered the back of her hand as he crossed the line. Or do you think that apart from money, the only thing that a couple needs to maintain their relationship is sex? Even when Xiangnan is sick, he doesn't accompany you. Can't you ask him to? Wen Yuan turned and stared at him. After a long time, she said in a very soft voice, Yi Mubai, none of this has anything to do with you. If you continue to care about me like this, I'll think that you're seducing me. The one who seduced me was you. Yi Mubai took a step forward. Is it because he doesn't treat you well and doesn't care about you that you came up with the idea of seducing me to have sex and take revenge on him? Wen Yuan was stunned. Actually, it was just a misunderstanding during their first meeting, and she couldn't help herself. But for him to say this now, wasn't his brain a little too weird? And you're like a ridiculous actor, Wen Yuan. You don't even dare to fight for your own happiness. Yi Mubai chuckled. Yi Mubai chuckled. And you're like a ridiculous actor, Wen Yuan. You don't even dare to fight for your own happiness. He took out his phone and showed her a few photos. Did you go to the United States to escape from this? Chapter 3655. Yi Mubai stared at her and said, Bai Shuili is his ex-wife, isn't she? They have a child now. Wen Yuan, you sacrificed a lot to keep this marriage. Don't say anymore. Wen Yuan's lips were cold. It has nothing to do with you, nothing to do with it at all. Yi Mubai looked at her and said, Is it? Do you dare to say that you don't know? Do you dare to say that you're not afraid of divorce? She bit her lips. Because he was humiliated, he didn't say it directly, but the meaning he expressed couldn't be more obvious. It was nothing more than that there was no love between them, but she insisted on clinging to the position of Mrs. Yi and refused to let go. Wen Yuan looked at her and then smiled faintly. Divorce? After the divorce, will Yi Mubai marry me? Yes, you're right. I know he has a woman outside. He always has, and the one he loves isn't me. But so what? As long as I'm Mrs. Yi, I have everything. Yi Mubai's face was terrifyingly cold. He looked at this woman and felt that she was terribly vain. She was just like the women in his circle. She was a utilitarian, emotionless creature who only cared about fame and profit. Although he looked down on Wen Yuan, Yi Mubai liked Xiangnan very much and treated Xiangnan really well. He treated Wen Yuan like winter, but to Xiangnan, he was as warm as spring. However, in front of Xiangnan, his attitude towards Wen Yuan was very restrained. Wen Yuan didn't defend himself, but she seemed to have lost her confidence. Yi Mubai's impression of her was really terrible. Perhaps it was because he was full of vigilance against her like before, only making love and not making love. She remembered that he was schemed to have sex with her for the first time. Rather than saying that it was Yi Mulin who schemed against him, it was more like she schemed against him. It was her first time, but it wasn't his. But after drinking the spiked wine, it was as if he had eaten a jar of village medicine and almost killed her. The second day after, she couldn't walk for almost a day. When he woke up, He was furious. His face was dark, as though he could not accept the fact that he had slept with her. In his heart, she was Yi Mulin's fiancée and a woman who occupied his position. He felt unfair for Bai Shuili, and now that he had lost his memory, he still rejected her. Just like after they slept together again many times. The second time was when he was drunk and she went to his apartment to take care of him. Nothing happened that night, but the next morning, she took a shower before going to work, and the bathroom door unexpectedly opened. Wen Yuan would never be able to forget the way Yi Mubai had looked at her. It had been very passionate. Later, he had walked over and pressed her against the wall, demanding her in a very rough manner. She didn't know if he was disgusted with her or self-abased, but he didn't kiss her lips. He just wanted to vent. Afterward, she collapsed on the bathroom floor while he took a shower and sat outside to smoke. By the time she left, there were already 7 or 8 cigarette butts in the ashtray in front of him. He treated her very badly. At that time, when Yuan felt that he was a lowly person. He was such a gentle person, but she didn't leave. Instead, she waited at the same spot. What was she expecting? She probably didn't know herself. She pulled her clothes and said that she was going to be late, so she had to leave. Yi Mubai reached out to hold her arm and pulled her into his arms. His voice was hoarse. Do it again. Chapter 3656. Their real relationship started after that time. When Yuan knew that he didn't like her. Yi Mubai had a little princess in his heart named Lin Sisi. Lin Sisi's background was similar to Bai Shuili's, but after the Lin family was defeated, Lin Sisi's father didn't go to jail. However, Lin Sisi's life wasn't as good as Bai Shuili's. She only met Gu Zhe after wandering for so long and was badly hurt. When Yuan couldn't be jealous of Lin Sisi because she was someone who was on the same level as her and Mubai. Lin Sisi and Gu Zhe never really separated because Gu Zhe didn't want to let go. When Yuan didn't know if Mubai was waiting for Lin Sisi, but she knew that Mubai didn't like her. He had sex with her only because of his physical needs. He hated her. Last time they were schemed against. Yi Mulin schemed against them, as she schemed against Mubai. This time, they had sex when they were both sober. After it was over, when Yuan lay on his shoulder, panting heavily. So did he. When everything calmed down, when Yuan said hoarsely, "I'm going to be late." She wanted to get up, but he held her waist and said in a hoarse voice, "I have something to say to you." Her body stiffened. After a while, she said, "Can we talk tonight?" Yi Mubai was still holding her down, but he let go of her after a while. When Yuan fell to the side, looking very embarrassed, he lit a cigarette and puffed out smoke for a long time before saying, "Come over tonight." When Yuan looked at him with a surprised and hurt expression. At night, she came over. His part-time worker left after cooking. When she saw Wen Yuan, her eyes were a little sad. Yi Mubai sat at the dining table and asked her to come over to eat. After Wen Yuan sat down, he didn't say anything and just ate quietly. She wanted to say something, but gave up after thinking about it. They ate together like this, and then he went to the study. Wen Yuan washed the dishes and followed him. Yi Mubai sat there and gestured for her to sit down. Then he said to her directly, "We can maintain our physical relationship until you and my brother get married, or when you're ready to have sex with him, we'll end it." Wen Yuan looked at him. In his cold eyes, she knew for the first time that he was not easy to talk to. She said softly, "What if I don't agree? Suit yourself." Yi Mubai took a puff of the cigarette and stared at her face. "If you don't want to, you can leave now. No one is forcing you, but..." He took out a box of medicine from the drawer. "I didn't take any protection this morning, so I took the medicine." He said it calmly, but when Yuan's entire body was ice cold. There was a hint of moisture in her eyes, but she couldn't say it out loud. She lowered her eyes and smiled faintly. "I understand." She took the box of medicine, opened it, and put the small pill in her mouth. The medicine dissolved, and it was very bitter. She swallowed it, and it was a little painful, just like the time he took her body. Done. She held the box of medicine in her hand, as if she was holding onto the last piece of driftwood, and walked out of the study. Yi Mubai stopped her. "Wen Yuan." She turned her head and looked at him. She thought that there was a hint of expectation in her eyes. He couldn't have missed it. Chapter 36:57. She was so embarrassed that she didn't say anything. He said again, "And I only like your body." He stood up from behind the desk and walked towards her. He walked straight to her and said, "You still have one choice, which is to gamble and break up with my brother. But I can't guarantee that I will marry you, and I can't guarantee that I will love you even after we get married." She said that Yi Mubai was a bastard. She even wanted to slap him. However, her hand was caught by him in the air. He held her hand and whispered, "Bai Shueli, aren't you a jerk? You're even more slutty. You're with my brother while seducing me. You're afraid that after we get married, my brother won't be able to satisfy you without touching you. That's why you picked me and slept with me to satisfy your desires, right?" She was even more embarrassed. He clearly knew that she liked him, but he still said such unbearable words to her. She pulled the door handle and wanted to leave, but her waist was caught by an arm, and she fell into his arms. He was very tall and easily restrained her. He lowered his head and buried his face in her neck and bit hard. "Are you angry? Didn't sleeping with me satisfy your desires? Why are you crying now?" He reached out and stroked her face. It was covered in cold tears. "Wen Yuan, what kind of woman are you? While sleeping with me, you still appear with Yi Mulin and the Yi clan, laughing and chatting with the elders, and even calling him Mulin so intimately. You were born to be an actor, weren't you? Not learning to be an actor is a waste of your good genes." He said in a mocking and sarcastic manner. Wen Yuan struggled. "I'm a slut. I'm an actor. Why aren't you getting away from me? Yi Mubai, why are you hugging me? Let go of me." She struggled and screamed because he carried her to the sofa again and pinned her down with half of his body to prevent her from moving. She gasped and glared at the man above. "Yi Mubai, you're so shameless. You look down on me and hate me, yet you're still pressing down on me." Because he pinned her down and freed one hand to gently stroke her face. His voice was hoarse. "Because I like to play with you." His thin lips pressed against her ear, and he kissed there gently. A man likes a woman. One is true love, and the other is to sleep with her. Wen Yuan was stunned, and then she struggled violently and screamed, "I don't want to. Do you know how loud and intoxicated you were when we did it in the bathroom this morning? Do you want to see how you do it with me before you decide whether you want to be my sister-in-law?" After Yi Mubai finished speaking, he reached out and pressed a button. The entire bookcase on the opposite wall suddenly turned around, revealing an entire wall of mirrors behind it. The curtains of the floor-to-ceiling windows also slowly closed, and Yi Mubai was already unbuttoning his shirt. Wen Yuan was stunned for a moment before he pushed him away forcefully and ran toward the door. He quickly dragged her back and carried her directly to the mirror. Her clothes fell to the ground, and soon the study was filled with sounds of lovemaking after a long time. The blood burned, and everything calmed down. Yi Mubai was still hugging her from behind. He pressed his face against hers and forced her to look at the unbearable scene in the mirror. "Did you see that? How did you respond to me just now? Are you sure you can still be my sister-in-law after we've done it?" Chapter 36:58. He said to give her a choice, so she gave him a choice. Wen Yuan was not an idiot. She knew very well that she and Yi Mulin were no longer engaged. If she slept with Yi Mubai, he would just be sleeping with her for free. He was doing this for Bai Shueli and Yi Mulin, and in his heart, she was a lowly woman with no integrity. After she asked, her chin was bitten by Yi Mubai. It was a heavy bite, and she almost screamed. Opening her eyes, she looked at him with tears hanging on her long eyelashes. She said in a low voice, "Are you not willing?" Actually, Wen Yuan knew her conditions. She was very good. If she was worthy of Yi Mulin, how could she not be worthy of Yi Mubai? He was not willing because he did not like her. He only liked her body and only liked to do it with her. This was what he said. Yi Mubai looked at Wen Yuan in the mirror. Just as she thought, she was very good enough to be a princess. The first time he did it with her, she was a virgin and had no experience. He could even feel that she did not even have the experience of a deep kiss. This was not strange because his brother would not touch her. She had always been a virgin and made herself an old lady. Wen Yuan and Yi Mu Bai were 30 years old when they had sex. However, because she had not experienced anything, she was still young and good-looking. She had a gentle temperament, but she gave Yi Mu Bai the feeling that she was scheming. He could not describe the feeling. Moreover, her attitude towards him was not cold, but it was seductive. He was not on guard and had sex with her. There were some things that they both knew. His brother wanted her to break off the engagement, and there was a condition for her to do so, which was for Yi Mu Bai to take over. No matter how stupid he was, he understood that her target had always been him. What a lunatic! He leaned against her face and stared at her. Do you think I would keep such a scheming woman by my side? Wen Yuan looked down and smiled. Then why did you still sleep with me? Physical needs. You can't be taking it seriously. He said insincerely. You are so wooden. The women outside are more interesting than you. Truth be told, he couldn't even deceive himself with these words. Wen Yuan's body was very soft. She was very fair and beautiful, and she took good care of herself. His fingers would melt wherever he went. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been so beastly and wanted her a total of 4 times today. It was just that he had just done it, and now he wanted it again. Wen Yuan closed his eyes. Then you're not willing to marry me, are you? He stared into her eyes. I told you, we'll talk about this after you break off the engagement. When she opened her eyes again, she did not say anything but quietly put on her clothes. He thought she had rejected him, but later, when he was in B City, she would come over occasionally. Yi Mu Bai had never thought that her occasional visits were all on days when she was prone to getting pregnant, and that she had pierced a hole in the condom he had placed at the head of the bed. That time, when she came over, he happened to be meeting a B-list actress to discuss a contract. His assistant had just left, and the B-list actress seemed to have gone crazy. She thought that she would have to sleep with him just because she was acting, so she stripped to the point where she could not be seen. He had just tossed her clothes over when Yuan arrived. When she opened the door of the study, she was a little shocked. She looked at them like a wife caught in the act of adultery. Chapter 36:59. Then why was she looking at him with such a gaze? It was as though he had done something terribly wrong. There was no need for him to explain himself to her, but he didn't want to sleep with that second rate. Hence, he asked the second rate to take his clothes and leave. Wen Yuan wanted to leave too, but she didn't say anything. In the end, it was Yi Mu Bai who dragged him back. He looked into her eyes. Why did you come back? Wen Yuan pursed his lips tightly, a resolute expression on his face. She looked at the tips of her shoes and chuckled. I won't come back again. Yi Mu Bai furrowed his brows and looked at her. Wen Yuan pushed his hand away and took a step back. Yi Mu Bai, in your heart, I'm no different from these women, right? He suddenly felt a little frustrated and placed his hand in his pocket. She chuckled again. That's right. How can you think highly of a woman who sent herself over for you to play with? She raised her head and looked at him. Yi Mu Bai, actually you're right. I do like you. Everything I did was to get close to you, including my engagement with your brother. You think I'm crazy, but how is Yi Mulin any better? You clearly know that we're fake. You think I'm using him, but he's not using me. From another perspective, I'm helping him, but why would I help him? It's all because of you. Because of you, you bastard. After Wen Yuan said that, she pushed him away and wanted to run. He grabbed her wrist to stop her from running. His voice was extremely hoarse. Wen Yuan, speak clearly. But before he could understand, the second-rate came out with his clothes on and a condom in his hand. He gulped. Director Yi, I found this condom in the bedside cabinet. It seems to have a hole in it. There's a big box of condoms over there that have all been pierced. Yi Mu Bai was stunned. Then, his gaze landed on Wen Yuan's face, and he asked softly, You pierced it? Wen Yuan didn't say anything, but his face was pale. Yi Mu Bai spoke again. You want to get pregnant with my child? She didn't deny it. Yi Mu Bai narrowed his eyes. Wen Yuan, you crazy woman, do you know what you are doing? Do you think I will marry you just because you are pregnant? I'm pregnant. If you don't marry Yi Mulin, you have to. Her voice was calm, as if she had thought about it 1,000 times. As soon as she finished speaking, Yi Mu Bai slapped her in the face. He was usually the most gentle person, But this was the first time he hit a woman, and the woman he hit was a woman who was related to him. He grabbed her hand and said angrily, "Follow me." The second-string actor was so scared that he peed his pants. His legs were weak because he recognized that this woman was a celebrity. She was Yi Mulin's fiancée, which meant that she was Director Ye's future sister-in-law. They were actually having an affair. The second-rate prostitute gulped. Yi Mubai swept her out and got into his car with Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan shrank in the back seat of the car. "Yi Mubai, where are you taking me?" "Go to the hospital," he said shortly. "I want to check if you're pregnant." Wen Yuan screamed, "You're crazy. I don't want to go." However, he steeled his heart and ignored her. He directly made a call and found an expert to wait for him. He drove over and dragged her to the examination room. They did an ultrasound, urine test, and blood test to prove that she was not pregnant. After everything was done, Wen Yuan refused to get into his car at the entrance of the hospital. She just looked at him and kept backing away until she got into a taxi. After that, Wen Yuan did not look for him again. He knew that she was probably scared and gave up, until one day, he drank too much and drove to Wen Yuan's apartment. He knocked on her door, and when she came out, she was only wearing a bathrobe, as if she had just taken a shower. He was drunk and pushed her in, forcing himself on her twice without protection. In the end, he sobered up and seemed to regret it. He slowly let go of her and did not even finish. He lay down at the side and only turned to her after a long time. "Wen Yuan, I'm sorry. I drank too much." Wen Yuan curled up in the corner of the sofa, her bathrobe hanging on her body. Her exposed skin was green and purple, accusing him of being rough just now. Yi Mubai looked at her for a long time and finally wrote her a check for 10 million yuan. He left, and Wen Yuan tore the check into pieces. Pieces of the check floated down. She laughed. It was great that he thought of her as a prostitute. After that incident, they did not care about each other. She did not take the initiative to contact him either. She did not have the mood or energy to scheme against a man later on. She felt unwell and went to the hospital. Before she could get a checkup, she met Yi Mubai. Lin Cece was sick. He would talk to Lin Cece, and when Lin Cece smiled, he would smile even more happily. At that time, Bai Shuili thought that he would actually love someone. He just did not love her. He just hated her. Chapter 3660. Wen Yuan just stood there and looked at him quietly. Lin Cece didn't look well. She was probably feeling unwell, so he helped her up. The concern and love in his eyes couldn't be hidden. It was something that Wen Yuan had always wanted. She thought about it. They had done it many times, but he had never shown any warmth to her. It was so obvious that he hated her. She thought that she didn't feel pain. She thought that in the world of love, she only needed one person to contribute. She just needed to look at him. But now, she realized that a one-man show was actually so laughable and heartbreaking. This was especially so for her. When she was feeling unwell or sick, she also needed someone by her side. But she couldn't do anything. She could only continue walking forward, pretending that she didn't see them, pretending that she wasn't hurt. Yi Mubai still saw Wen Yuan. He stared at her and gently let go of Lin Cece. "I'll go." Lin Cece and Bai Shuili were so close. How could she not know Wen Yuan? But she only knew him in the past and didn't know him. But looking at Yi Mubai's expression now, why did she feel that there was something going on between Yi Mubai and Wen Yuan? Sister-in-law and brother-in-law. Just thinking about it made her excited. Lin Cece had coincidentally said goodbye to Lao Bai. He was going to Yunnan, so he had tea with her. But she had diarrhea, so Lao Bai sent her over. She didn't expect to meet Wen Yuan. But the way Wen Yuan looked at Lao Bai, it was like a story was written in every minute. Yi Mubai patted Lin Cece's arm gently. "I'll send you back later." "It's okay, Mubai, I'm much better." Lin Cece smiled brightly. She waved at him and said deliberately, "Go and see your sister-in-law." Yi Mubai glanced at her. He wasn't sure if Lin Cece knew anything. But in the end, he didn't say anything and quickly chased after Wen Yuan. He caught up to Wen Yuan at the elevator and dragged her out. "Why are you here?" Wen Yuan stared at him for a long time before saying slowly, "I'm not feeling well." His lips moved as if he wanted to ask something, but he didn't. Wen Yuan broke free from his embrace and said quietly, "If there's nothing else, I'm going up. I have an appointment with a specialist." Yi Mubai pursed his lips and didn't say anything. In the end, Wen Yuan still entered the elevator. When the elevator doors closed, neither of them thought that this might be the last time they would see each other in this lifetime. When Yi Mubai returned, Lin Cece was already gone. He looked at the time and rushed to catch his plane. Wen Yuan, on the other hand, was lining up for a checkup in the hospital's long corridor. He felt nauseous and wanted to vomit. It took him a long time to go from the gastroenterology department to the internal medicine department. Finally, an older doctor said, "There's no problem. Miss Wen, why don't you go to the obstetrics department?" Obstetrics, not gynecology. Wen Yuan froze, his fingers clutching his bag tightly. After a long time, he finally asked in a low voice, "What do you mean?" The middle-aged female doctor's tone was gentle. "Miss Wen may be a mother." Many people knew that Wen Yuan was Yi Mulin's fiancée. It wasn't strange that she had a child. Therefore, the doctor congratulated her. Wen was. And she was. Like a zombie, she walked to the obstetrics and gynecology department. In front of her, there was a long line of women. They all had big bellies and happy smiles on their faces. Chapter 36-61. She might be pregnant, but could she be as happy as them? She didn't queue up. She escaped from the hospital as if she was escaping. She secretly bought a pregnancy test at the pharmacy. In the bathroom of the bathroom, she saw the legendary 2 lines. She scratched her hair and sat on the floor of the bathroom. She put her face in her arms. She was pregnant. When she was about to give up on Yi Mubai, the baby, it should be that night when he drank too much and almost raped her. He drank too much, so he didn't take any protection. That day was also her safe period, so she didn't take any medicine. She was pregnant. It was Yi Mubai's child. In fact, he was the only man she had. Wen Yuan closed her eyes. She had no strength in her whole body. From day to night, she maintained the same action. She just looked at the phone. At 10 o'clock in the evening, she called Yi Mubai's phone. He picked up after a long time. Wen Yuan hugged herself with one hand and called his name softly. "Mubai, if..." On the other side of the phone, Yi Mubai frowned and then said in a low voice, "What's the matter?" Wen Yuan lowered her eyes and said softly, "If I break up with him publicly and say that I've always liked you, will you be willing to marry me?" Without waiting for him to answer, she said hurriedly, "I only have you as a man. There really is no one else." Yi Mubai was silent for a while and then said in a low voice, "Wen Yuan, you're not young anymore. You're not a little girl anymore. Can you be more mature and rational? We can't be together just because you broke up with my brother. You can marry someone else, but if you marry me, the consequences will be very serious." What will happen? Wen Yuan's emotions were a little unstable. Will it make you unhappy? Will it make you not want to go home? Yi Mubai, if you don't like me, why do you sleep with me again and again? It's a consensual thing. Yi Mubai's voice seemed ruthless in the dark night. Wen Yuan, don't be childish. This world is not something you can get just because you like it. It's the same for me. Let's both be more mature, okay? She was still stunned, but she seemed to understand something. Yi Mubai might never like her. She hung up without saying anything about her pregnancy. After hanging up the phone, the night was still dark. She didn't turn on the lights, so she cried in the dark. She had brought this upon herself. He was partly responsible for the child's accident, but it was also her own carelessness. She had once wanted his child so badly, but now she was so afraid of his arrival. Wen Yuan stayed at home the whole time. The next day, she didn't go to work. She forgot about the time and everything. She only snapped back to reality when it started pouring outside. However, when she picked up her phone to call Yi Mubai to tell him about her pregnancy, she couldn't get through. She frantically searched for him. She called him hundreds of times, but his phone was still turned off. She looked for Yi Mulin. She tried everything she could, but all she got was Yi Mubai's broken phone. She had really thought that he was dead, but he was still alive. He had lost his memory, but he still hated her. Wen Yuan looked at Yi Mubai and slowly came back from his memories. A bitter smile appeared at the corner of his lips. Yes, he still hated her. Actually, she didn't care that much anymore. He hadn't been by her side for so many years. She was fine, and so was Xiangnan. Maybe he just couldn't accept it. Maybe it was because he had lost his memory that she wanted to take advantage of the situation. But when he thought about it, would he be disgusted and say that she was scheming and shameless? This book came from You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.